My name is Time Smiley. I'm an administrative assistant at the JES, and I'm here to do a couple of things before we start tonight's program. Just as a warning, I am suffering from allergies, so if you hear me sniffling, please try to ignore me. But I'm going to go over some housekeeping notes and tell you about some JES events and introduce tonight's presenter. For our housekeeping, if you need any assistance during the event, please ask me. And there will be a Q&A portion after the event. Just make sure to raise your hand and try to speak loudly and clearly so that everybody can hear you. And then for our upcoming events, at 7 p.m. tomorrow, Kimberly Montague will be speaking about the Trinity of American Architecture, Richardson, Sylvian, and Wright at JES. And then at Wednesday at 6 p.m., Dr. Judy Lynch, who's here tonight with us, will be talking about her book, America's Early Frontier, Economic History of Northwestern Pennsylvania, 1753 to 2024. I had to fit in the full title for you, Judy. And she will be diving into the Harbor Creek chapters at Harbor Creek. Finally, Thursday at 7 p.m., Dr. Robert Spiel will deliver a lecture at the JES called U.S.-Canada Comparisons and Relations in 2025. What's happening? What's next? Alrighty. And then for tonight's presenter, we have Richard Arthur. He is a native of Pittsburgh and a 23-year veteran Army officer. He has a lifelong interest in history with a particular focus on the American colonial period. He has given talks on the Founding Fathers, the Continental Army, and lectured on the role of Pennsylvanians on the planning and actions of D-Day, including stories based on interviews with participants. He earned his bachelor's degree from Allegheny College and his master's from George Washington University. He and his wife, Mary Lou, live in rural Erie County, where they operate Winter's End, an environment that supports bees and butterflies. Let's give Richard Arthur a warm JES welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone coming out this evening. For the last year and a half, I, as a member of the Fort LaBeouf Historical Society, of course, were up to here in George Washington, you know. And it suddenly occurred to me that we were approaching a very, very important anniversary. And I was very fortunate to run into Judy Lynch, who was going to talk to me about somebody that was really important to her and has become really important to me. I'm going to start out by just pointing out that I'm using the word founding father for a man who was born in France and who was never technically an American citizen. So where do we go from here? Why would I use that term? And what kind of things are we going to talk about might indicate some importance here with, here we go. Lafayette was born into a noble family in the center of France in a very, very small town. But his family was part of the nobility. His father was an army officer who was killed in the 7 Years' War, and he never saw his son. Lafayette's mother didn't really like living out in the country very much, and she wanted to be part of the court at Versailles. So she picked up and moved to Paris and left young Lafayette here in the country under the care of his grandparents. Now, he loved the country. He would go out and pretend that he was going out to slay monsters. He was going to be a soldier, lead the neighborhood boys in adventures in the woods. And that's the kind of life he lived until he was about 9. And his mother called him to Paris. She felt, well, maybe it's time for young Lafayette to learn what's going on in the world of nobility. So she called him up there, and he was forced to kind of change venues. Along the way, while he was still a very, very young 12 or 13-year-old, he inherited his family's fortune. He became one of the richest men in Europe at an age that most of us would consider going to junior high. He also had a forced marriage, or an arranged marriage, with a member of the Noailles family. This nobleman had several daughters, and he wanted to find a good partner for one of his daughters. This is Adrienne. Now, even though Lafayette had an arranged marriage and married at a very early age, that marriage remained rock solid for the rest of their lives, and she really deserves a talk all of her own. She was a remarkable woman. Okay, Lafayette goes off to Paris. He now is going to learn to become a gentleman. And what do you have to do? You have to learn how to dance properly. You need to know how to ride a horse properly. You need to know how to play cards. And you need to know how to make interesting conversation. And you probably also need to learn the basics of how to take a mistress, because that was the way they lived in the nobility in France at the time. None of this really was of great interest to Lafayette. He was very clumsy in his efforts to learn things. Even as he learned how to dance, Marie Antoinette used to laugh at him. He was kind of a laughing stock of the court. But at the court, he had an opportunity to run into some interesting folks. He met Rousseau, he met Voltaire, and he was on the verge of right there where the most interesting and revolutionary talks at the time were being shared. So he was able to pick up a little of that. But where he really learned what was important to him was through a couple of different things. He had some friends who were interested in the American Revolution. And they started to talk about the American Revolution and how interesting this was to people who'd grown up in France, knowing only the nobility as the way to have a government. He also had joined the Masons. That influenced his thinking. But perhaps most important of all, he ran into this guy while he was stationed in Metz, which is in the eastern part of France. If you look at that guy's face, you might say, I think I've seen him before. You probably haven't, but you've probably seen his brother. That is the Duke of Gloucester. His brother was King George III. Now, the Duke of Gloucester was in complete sympathy with the American Revolution. He thought that George Washington was the greatest thing going, and he told young Lafayette. Young Lafayette bought into this 100%. He said, I'm going to go to America. He went to Paris, and he met American diplomats who were recruiting French officers for the American cause. And they sent him on his way to America on a ship that he bought with his own money and with a group of soldiers that he recruited himself. He had to sneak out of France. It was a cat and mouse journey to get out of France because the king had ordered all of his officers, nobody goes to America. You will be defying the king. But he gets a ship, he sneaks out, and the guys who were coming to capture him, who had been chasing him around France, arrived just to see the sails sinking over the horizon, and Lafayette is on his way to America. Why did he go to America? Well, I think we can learn a lot from this message that he wrote to his pregnant wife, who he did not tell that he was leaving Europe and going across the ocean, probably for deniability, so that she couldn't know where he was. But I love the note that he wrote to her, because it tells us a lot about Lafayette. You can read the top, but I love this part right here. The happiness of America, a place he's never been, is intimately tied to the happiness of all humanity. America will become the respected and secure haven of virtue, tolerance, and equality and peaceful freedom. He was 100% committed to an idea and a place that he'd never been. He arrives in South Carolina. The first person that he meets when he gets off the ship, and this ship didn't go into the main harbor. It went into a little town called Georgetown. They had to skirt around so the British couldn't find him, because he would have been a prize to capture. So it was cat and mouse. They got to Georgetown. He got off the ship, and the first person he meets is a slave, who, by the way, actually spoke French. And he is able to get him oriented and on his way for the rather difficult trip from South Carolina up to Philadelphia, where he met the Congress. There's the Congress of the United States. They weren't impressed. They were not impressed. But he did have a 60,000-pound bag of treasure that he gave to John Hancock, who was the president of the Congress, and John Hancock said, well, I guess we can arrange a meeting with Washington. And by now, Washington was sick of seeing these people come from Europe. They all want rank. They all want money. They all want fame and glory. They don't know what they're doing. So he's already predisposed not to be too impressed. But one enchanted evening on August 4th, 1777, at City Tavern in Philadelphia, young Marquis de Lafayette meets George Washington. He sees him come in the room and instantly knows that's the man. He could tell by looking at him. Now, what do we know about Washington looking at this yet another foreign officer? He was impressed. Lafayette had bearing. He had a fancy uniform. And George Washington was someone who was very, very conscious of someone's presence and their appearance. So he gets to talking with him, and they have a little discussion. And he said, okay, I can give you an opportunity to work with me. I will put you on my staff. And Lafayette goes, oh, gee, the staff? I want to lead troops. I don't want to be in a staff. Washington's thinking, this is a foreigner. I don't want to give him command of American troops, but I do like him. I do want to watch out for him. I want him around, but I want him in my staff. So Lafayette was going to have to wait for his opportunity to prove that he had stuff. Keep in mind, he had never had any formal military training other than how to march on a parade ground. His opportunity came very, very quickly. Washington was trying to defend along the Brandywine Creek, which is south of Philadelphia, against the British attack that was aimed at the nation's capital, Philadelphia. He had a pretty good defensive position, but some Quakers who were loyalists decided that they would go and tell the British soldiers, hey, there's a bypass up here. There's a ford that goes up here up the river, and you can take that and come around and surprise Washington. So they did that. And now Washington's army was in danger. You can imagine the chaos at his headquarters. He's receiving reports. He's trying to send people here and there. He's trying to do something. In what I call a put-me-in-coach type minute, Lafayette goes to Washington and said, I'll go out there and I'll fix it. Quite a bold statement. He did. He went out there and he fixed it. In broken English, he was able to go out and rally the troops to a point where they were able to get reorganized and form up and save this battle from being a defeat. It was more or less a tie. But it was not a defeat. And here is a guy who had never been under fire going out and proving himself. Nathaniel Greene, who was Washington's trusted second in command, said, this young man needs to be given a command. Now, in the battle, while he was gathering strength and organizing troops, he was shot, wounded. So he's on the battlefield. A young lieutenant who could speak French, James Monroe, comes up and helps him off the battlefield. Takes him to Washington's headquarters. Washington turns to his surgeon and says, take care of this man like he was my son. Keep in mind, Washington had no natural children. Lafayette had no father. There was the bond that formed that I think is the most consequential bond that's probably ever occurred in American history. He not only did well that day, but when he was able to get back on a horse while he was recovering, he proved himself valuable at a battle in New Jersey. That night, after doing basically the same thing he had done in Brandywine, Washington, who was known as someone who was keep to himself, put his cloak down on the ground and collapsed in exhaustion because it was the longest battle time-wise in the American Revolution. It was very, very hot. Washington calls Lafayette and says, come over here, you can lay down here beside me. And Nathaniel Greene, who knew Washington well, said, that was something you never saw. The bond between these two men was very, very special. Lafayette was there at Valley Forge, and he suffered the deprivations and the challenges of that day, that winter. But then he goes to France. Washington says, okay, you can go over to France. Why did he go over to France? He was going to go over and get resources that we needed to tip the balance in our favor. So he goes over, he meets with Benjamin Franklin, who's already over there negotiating. Franklin is charming the ladies. Lafayette is working with people he knew in the royalty, who by this time had forgiven him for running away and were quite impressed with what he had done. Eventually, Lafayette's efforts would result in about 40% of the entire French army being sent to America to help us in the last stages of the war, as well as getting critical naval support and tipping the battle just before Yorktown that bottled up the British fleet. So his work as a diplomat is extremely important. If he never served on the battlefield, he would still be very, very important. This is the Battle of the Capes. The French Navy beat the British Navy, surprised everyone, and really helped tip the balance for Yorktown. Now, after the American Revolution, Lafayette goes back to his country, and of course, they are in the middle of social turmoil. It's hard to even begin to compress any kind of story as complicated as the French Revolution, so I won't even try. What I will say is that typically what you had was you had lunatics over here, crazy people over here, and they would go back and forth, taking turns in power. And in the middle, you had Lafayette, who always tried to be the voice of moderation. And like so often happens, the voice of moderation is the one that's not followed. But he certainly came up with a lot of good ideas that were eventually part of the French Constitution. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that at one point, he appeared on a balcony above a bunch of angry French citizens, trying to calm them down. He went out with Marie Antoinette, kissed her hand, and wore a little cockade, a little ribbon that he thought would help to try to bring things together. So the rebels had red and blue, and the royalty had white. So he made this ribbon of 3 colors. Where do we see that today? It may very well have been that Lafayette was the inspiration behind the tricolor, the French flag. He was, along with Thomas Jefferson, the author of a Declaration of Human Rights, which is incorporated into the UN Charter and is part now of the French Constitution. Unfortunately, it didn't have any pull at the time, but certainly the effort was made. The revolution was really bad to Lafayette. He lost most of his money. He lost his title because the revolution basically abolished all titles. They changed the days of the week and the months of the year and all that kind of stuff. They changed everything. So he's stripped of his title, he's stripped of his fortune, he's afraid for his life. He sends his son, George Washington Lafayette, to America, where George Washington helps keep him safe. But Lafayette leaves France and goes into Prussia, where they take him prisoner because they think he's against the royalty, which he wasn't. He actually favored a government much like the one they had in Britain, constitutional monarchy. He was thrown in prison for 5 years. He was in prison for 5 years. But this is the remarkable part. When he was there, his wife and daughters came and stayed in the prison cell with him. I think that's a testament to their family ties and their family values. Eventually, of course, the revolution gets out of control. They chop people's heads off. They turn to Napoleon. Lafayette tries to work with Napoleon, tries to get him to be reasonable. He basically ignored him. In his dying days, he said that Lafayette was probably the most important voice of France at the time. That's coming from Lafayette or from Napoleon. Okay, we're going to now jump ahead to the year 1824. Now he is poor. He has very, very little money. He has no more title. He still has his home, but that's about it. President of the United States, James Monroe, the same James Monroe who helped him off the battlefield at Brandywine, is trying to prepare America for its 50th anniversary, just as we right now are trying to prepare for our 250th anniversary. And he thinks, why don't we invite Lafayette back? He's the only surviving general of the Revolution, and he could be our nation's guest. So he arranges for a ship to go over, pick him up, bring him back to America, and he starts on a triumphal tour. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of that tour, but if you're curious, you can come up here and look at this map. He went to all 24 states, and The important thing to understand is that every single town he went to, no matter how big or how small, the people at the time knew about Lafayette's contribution to our independence. He was venerated as a hero, and very deservedly. Every town he went to, there'd be some bloviating politician making a speech. There would be huge triumphal arches that would have been built. There would have been a bad band. There would have been a mediocre meal. And then they would have had an opportunity, to have Lafayette say a few words, and his speeches were very short, but they were always basically this: I love your country. It is wonderful to be here. I cannot tell you how much liberty means to me. I'm so proud of what you've done in the 50 years since you had your independence. Everybody loved this guy. He had what you'd call a very high emotional IQ, I'm sure. I want to turn to the part of the journey near the end of his 14-month time here, 3,000-mile trip, to when he comes to Pennsylvania. He comes up the Ohio River from basically Cincinnati. He's on a barge. The barge sinks. Everyone on the barge is rescued by George Washington Lafayette, Lafayette's son. He couldn't save Lafayette's dog, and he couldn't save the cane that George Washington had given him, that very rarely escaped his grip. Most important souvenir he had. But everybody was able to survive. They get off at Wheeling, Virginia, not West Virginia at the time, and they take what was just constructed, the National Road. So he is taking a stagecoach along this newly fashioned road, kind of showing off what we've done here in America. This is what we've been working on, and this is one of our proud new accomplishments. First town he goes to is Washington, Pennsylvania. Now, you will note that he likes to go to places that were named for George Washington or were related to George Washington's history, or sometimes things that were named for him. So he makes an effort to stay at Washington, PA as his first stop. And then yeah, batteries are running low. He goes to Washington, PA. He then goes to visit Albert Gallatin, who was a very, very important member of the cabinet at the time, and he was a Swiss immigrant who spoke French as a native language. He had known Lafayette in Paris, so he hosted him at his home in Fayette County. So if you're ever in Fayette County, you can go to Friendship Hall and see the place that they met and see the home of Albert Gallatin. He then went to visit Braddock's Field. Braddock's Field is outside of Pittsburgh. The best way to define it is, if you've ever been to Kennywood Park, that's basically close to Braddock's Field. That was an important battle in young Washington's life, where his life was in peril, and he had to basically do the same thing that Lafayette did: step in, take leadership, and move on. He was then feted in Pittsburgh at a location down close to, excuse us.
Sorry, our laptop died at the charger. You will have to continue without the power.
That's fine. I know where we're going.
Everything is dying. It's fine.
He was hosted in Pittsburgh by a man by the name of Denny, who was the first mayor of Pittsburgh, whose roots were actually up here in Erie County. His father had been one of the original settlers up here. They then took an evening over in what we would call the north side. He stayed at a judge's house over there. What we know about that was that they had a reception, and I think this was typical, the kind of reception that they would give him. They'd have a lot of young girls dressed up in white and lace, and Lafayette would go around and kiss them on the forehead, and then he took the hands of the hostess and he would kind of give some type of French blessing, kiss her on both cheeks. It would have been very French, but it was very, very formal. They would have a nice formal dinner. The next day they got into an everyday mail-carrying stagecoach and traveled to Butler. They had a luncheon up there, the same speeches, the same bad bands, but they had sauerkraut up there, which he really liked. And that's what we learned from the history, is details like that he had a great amount of sauerkraut. He then traveled to Mercer, where he stayed overnight. Now, if you go down to the Mercer Historical Society today, you can see the bed that Lafayette slept in while he was there for that one short visit. Interesting thing about that was when the hotel caught on fire several years later, the manager of the hotel went up into the flames, broke the bed in pieces, and threw it out the window so that it could be saved and reused later. He then traveled to Meadville the next day. He had lunch at a place called the Stag, which is approximately where the downtown Meadville Mall is, like Chestnut and Water Street. And from there he went to Allegheny College, where he spoke from the steps of Bentley Hall, which was still being built. Interesting thing about that is we know he signed the guest book, and one of the first things that I've tried to find when I started to become interested in this was, where's the guest book? Well, they found the guest book, and it has Lafayette's signature, George Washington Lafayette, and everything. And that's actually on display in the library at Allegheny College right now. He then went that evening to Waterford, and he stayed overnight in Waterford. He stayed at a hotel that is in the location of today's post office, but across the street, the Eagle Hotel was being built. His host there was William King, a man he had served with in the Revolution, and his son Thomas King was the builder of the Eagle. So we like to say at the Eagle Hotel, Lafayette did not sleep here, but he came over to inspect the building. Just like people say, did Washington sleep in the Eagle Hotel? No, but he slept on that ground out there. He then left that morning and came by cavalry escort the whole way up to Erie. When he got to Federal Street, there were thousands and thousands of people lined up along State Street all the way down, even though at that time there was virtually nothing there. It was like woods, but people were crammed in the woods. They wanted to see Lafayette. Again, he had a nice reception. Judah Colt's building downtown. They held a luncheon for him again. They had the little girls dressed up. And one of the things they have at the Hagen History Center that I think is remarkable is they have an artifact with this little bonnet that somebody had made for one of those girls for that particular event. And I think it's a wonderful souvenir. They constructed a bridge across Mill Creek, which of course back then was open. Now it's under pavement. But it was nearly 200 feet long, and they had all of the important people of town invited to sit at this long table where dozens of toasts were given. But Lafayette at the very end said, "Toast to Erie. Your town is deeply embedded in American history. he was thinking of the War of 1812. And may it always prosper. So he was giving us a very, very good wish. At that meal, they had a tablecloth out here, and there was a coffee stain on this tablecloth. At the end of the day, they were very careful to keep this as a memento of the occasion. And they never cleaned the tablecloth because the coffee spill was Lafayette's coffee. He'd spilled it and preserved where he sat. And that was the kind of thing that happened back then. People were very, very concerned about that level of preservation of artifacts. I think that it's interesting, as they were leaving, one of the women yelled out to her husband, "Is that white-haired fellow over there Lafayette?" And the husband yelled back, "No, that's old coat. That's Lafayette's the one with the bay hair." Well, he didn't have bay hair at the time. He had white hair. He was wearing a wig, but that's what he always did. And people thought he had light hair, but we do have that little one. At the end, she said, "Oh, do tell." I don't know why that particular little story was told, but it's one we have. Something that happened here in Erie, that also happened in Pittsburgh, that also happened apparently several times during his 14-month trip. Someone would come up to him and say, "I was with you at Brandywine. I was right there when you were wounded. I was there." These old vets would tell that story. And he always responded, "I remember you." You know, these folks probably weren't there, but it was the way that he dealt with people. He always wanted it to be a positive experience. I think that must have been part of his diplomatic skill. But that was the type of relationship he had. It was a very short day. He left about 3 p.m. But what a day for Erie that must have been. He left, he went up to Buffalo. Then he was trying to get to Bunker Hill on the 4th of July because he was hoping to be there when they set the cornerstone for the Bunker Hill Monument. If you've ever been to Bunker Hill, you know they have a small Washington-type obelisk there. And he was going to set the cornerstone along with Daniel Webster. He did make it there in time, and he took the shovel. You know, they always have that picture in the newspaper of everybody getting the shovel. Well, he took the shovel, but he took a couple scoops because he had a cask, a small cask, and he put several shovelfuls in that cask and shipped that back to France. You know what that was for? To put on his grave. He was that committed to being an American. He was in spirit every bit as much American as a Frenchman. And of course, there's that great scene in 1917 when the American Expeditionary Force arrives in France, and General Pershing and his staff are there saluting Lafayette at his grave. And one of his staff members says, "Lafayette, we are here." I think an interesting observation about this, it's almost a story that I have a hard time believing, but I haven't heard anybody refute it. And I asked Mike Duncan, the writer of that book, which if you want the definitive book to read about Lafayette, this is a good book. And it's very, very good. Mike Duncan said he thinks that the story is true. There's been a flag, American flag, over Lafayette's grave continuously since the middle of the 19th century. That says a lot about the respect that maybe Americans or Frenchmen have for Lafayette. Think about what that means. That flag was there in 1943. It was there in 1944. It was there when Paris was occupied by Nazi Germany. They allowed that to stay in place. I said at the beginning, founding father. Okay. What's a founding father? Well, we all know George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. Those are founding fathers. What did they do to get the title? Well, George Washington was obviously a great military leader. Thomas Jefferson was, you could call him a political theorist, the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence. You could look at someone like Robert Morse, who was a financier, who allowed the banking system, as it was at the time, basically his own personal treasury, to be used to finance the American cause. Or you could say a diplomat like Benjamin Franklin was a founding father. All of those people did important, great services in one or two areas. The man I've been talking about was a soldier. He was a political theorist. He was a financier. And he was a diplomat. So I offer you a case that next year when we're thinking about our founding fathers, let's not do what has often been done and forget about Lafayette, a man who didn't share our birthright, didn't share our native language, didn't grow up in our own political system, but who somehow just fell in love with the idea of liberty and embraced it and gave it his all. There's a great quote in this book that my friend gave me when I first started out in this quest, and it was written and printed in 1825, so it was contemporary. I'll struggle to read this because the print's very small, but I love this paragraph. The hero of these memoirs has displayed a triumph unparalleled in the annals of the world. Not the triumph of the patriot or the philanthropist, but the triumph of principles, integrity, and virtue through all the extremes of prosperity and imprisonment and poverty, the summit of popular power, always true to himself. He remains unsullied with any touch of dishonor. And I thought, wow, that is quite a statement about someone. So let's not do what has often been done here in the 20th century and in the early 21st century, kind of pushing Lafayette off stage and forgetting about him. Oh, but wait, he was on stage, wasn't he? He was on stage in that musical Hamilton. The character in there, often played by a black man, didn't look like Lafayette. His times and places where he comes in and out of the story are not accurate at all. But I think the writer of that musical got it absolutely right, because Lafayette is the solid symbol of patriotism, honor, love of liberty, love of country. While all these other guys are over there doing all kinds of stuff, he is right in the middle, and he's steadfast, and I think that's very admirable. Do you have any questions? Thank you. Do you have any questions?
How old was Lafayette when he came to America the first?
19. He bought a ship He ran away from home, left his pregnant wife, came to America, and I guess he was 20 when he met George Washington in 1911. It's almost unimaginable. I mean, you know, those of us who've had 19-year-old kids know, watching MTV or whatever. Yeah. He did. He was absolutely fearless on the battlefield. He was stoic through his imprisonment. He must have been scared half the time the revolution was going on when he was in Paris. I think you're very right. I'm going to give you some good news. There was Lafayette, and there was George Washington Lafayette. And when I was in New York City in August, I got to meet the 9th generation of the Lafayette family. They are still there. Three wonderful women, mom and 2 daughters, and the American Friends of Lafayette bring them over every 5 years. So they come over all the time. Well, I don't know. The 2 younger daughters were relatively young. They were maybe 18, 19 years old. But they were very charming, and it was one of those things where you had an opportunity to talk to someone who actually was part of history. An interesting part of that story is we had these, at various times over this 4-day event in New York, we had different people who were impersonating Lafayette. We went to the South Port in Lower Manhattan. We went on a ship. We didn't sail, we just went on the ship to hear this lecture. And this one guy was there, and he was doing a great job as Lafayette, but he didn't know who those women were. And I thought, I'm just going to stand back and watch this. And the guy was like, that was very nice. Yes, sir.
Why exactly was he in prison for 5 years?
Well, he had left France out of fear for his life as the revolution got out of control. So he goes to Prussia, thinking that at the time they were neutral, but they felt that Lafayette, because he was a titled monarch who apparently had switched sides in their mind, he was a danger to all kings, including the people who were ruling in Central Europe at the time. So they threw him in because they didn't want any trouble. They saw him as trouble. His basic hope for France would have been to actually adopt, as much as he hated the British, he did kind of like their constitutional monarchy. He didn't want to do away with the King of France. That would have been too much of a, but he did want to liberalize it and have a constitution that would be a little more aligned with the one they have in Britain. But they didn't want to listen to that. They tried to break him out twice, and when he came back to New York, he met some of the people who had tried to break him out of jail. Sir.
So, how do you square his friendship with both Jefferson and Hamilton?
Oh, it's his personality. He would look for the good in everyone. In the French Revolution, that was part of his problem. The guys at the tennis court were way over here, but that's okay. There were some good people over there. I'm sure he probably looked at both Hamilton and Jefferson and saw good qualities in them, as did George Washington. George Washington was most of the time on good terms with both of them. And I think it was his personality.
Did he stay that apolitical in some sense?
Well, I think he was dedicated, like the guy in that book said, to ideals. And I think that how you delivered those was less important to him than, political structure, political parties, or whatever. He arrived here in 1824, which, by the way, was a year of one of the most contentious political elections that ever occurred in American history. And he did not take sides. He basically was telling people, hey, you're lucky. You've got choices, you've got freedoms, you've got opportunities to choose your leaders. And he was fine. He knew both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson and had a good relationship with both of them. He knew each one of the first 7 presidents of the United States. He knew Washington Irving. He knew James Fenimore Cooper. He knew Samuel F.B. Morse. When he went to Baltimore, 9-year-old Edgar Allan Poe recited a poem dedicated to him. He knew everybody. He knew Rousseau. He knew George III. He had met George III. He had met Louis XVI. He was the Forrest Gump of the late 19th or late 18th century. He knew everybody. Sir. Yeah, I think the problem would be trying to figure it out, how to cram it into 2.5 hours or whatever. Miniseries. Yeah, I agree. I don't know of a really good. Judy, do you know of a really?
I don't, but I think that's an excellent suggestion.
Yeah.
It really would be wonderful to see it.
Yeah.
HBO had a good John Adams series, I think.
Yeah, I mean that was well acted. Sure.
What was his actual occupation in the last 2/3 of his life after
Well, he would always be involved in trying to work different government problems as France transitioned from this wild back and forth revolution to a dictatorship under Napoleon, to Napoleon losing and being turned over to a monarchy. Every time he was trying to look for where is the sunshine in this transition. He thought when the king came back in, there might have been something, and then he got soured on the king. He thought when Napoleon first came in, that would have been better than the revolution. He was always looking for something like that. I think that would be his occupation. You could say he was a politician, but not really a partisan one.
Is the touring that you were talking in Philadelphia was in Erie, is it well documented at the sharply as that it says? Is it documented?
Well, they have just about everything that was written at the time. The newspaper accounts were really kind of thin, but they do have them over there. You can go over to the library. We had at the Jefferson the other day, we had several of the artifacts, and those are a nice testament to the time. Had a little calling cards and
That are at Pagan.
yeah.
They're not on display. I know they have.
They did have an exhibit on like the last year.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was they had gathered for artifacts different but Erie most.
Yeah. Yeah, they have serving pieces. They're doing something similar in Meadville at the end of May, or I guess actually the beginning of June. They're having a luncheon down there at the Baldwin Reynolds House. Yeah.
Down at Second and French date. They actually, the Perry Square Alliance is one.
Yes.
Create again. I don't know if you're speaking, but they are going to have speakers. Somebody drove this Lafayette in.
Yes. No, I just get to watch this time.
Great.
I don't think they have any tickets left.
The tickets are available.
Oh, they are?
Yeah, they are. It's limited. We just got ours yesterday or the day before. So I don't know how many tickets.
Yeah. Yeah, they're going to have an arrival. It'll be at the Children's Museum. They're going to have an arrival. It's nice to have something,
For the bridge, show for the bridge, speaking.
Yes.
Right, they had the dinner for all get there. They would look all with the bridge, but they else, but from here the ship. And then, I think they were the sparkles. I did. You don't have a stuff to say, but.
They are going to put up a notional tent or whatever at that event. They told me about that. There's not a whole lot of physical evidence there anymore. Judy and I spent a good day going down looking for what we could find, and we found a couple historical markers.
Is it on Holland Street there? Just in the hallway?
Yes, yeah. There are a couple markers, but it's not really very prominent. It should be. There is an effort going on to commemorate his arrival and visit to just about every one of these towns, and of course all the small towns in between. There's an organization that goes and puts these up, but you have to have the documentation. I couldn't put the documentation together for any place here in Erie County, but I haven't given up on it. It's something we can still do. I think we have sufficient evidence now for both Waterford and Erie, as well as Meadville. In Mercer, where he just basically stayed the night and slept in that bed that got thrown out the window, they're putting up a plaque at the beginning of June. They're going to have a plaque there. So there's an effort to commemorate it.
Is there any evidence that he's in the streets?
No. He basically traveled a route that would be pretty much along Route 19, which means that he might have passed through there, but I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything about that. I will say that Western Pennsylvania did a very bad job of documenting this. There are places in North Carolina and Alabama that have, just reams of information. And it's kind of sad that we don't have that here. Yes, ma'am.
Was this way to travel into here and the Concord there?
Well, one of the things that he did along the line, I talked about the National Road. There were sections of the Erie Canal that were open, and he traveled on some of those sections. He was trying to get the most expeditious way from point A to B. And of course, I think along that corridor, they had a pretty good stagecoach route too. But I don't know the specifics of it, but I do know that he was on the Erie Canal, which was not all complete, but was in sections. So he was able to see that as well as the National Road. So he was able to see some physical things that were evidence of our progress. It was very heartening to him.
If anybody's interested, in Washington, the Georgetown Mall, right on the river in Georgetown, the one perfume store still sells the perfume we do for.
But that is, I would not prefer to your guy. Hello. Because I got some from my husband.
Where was there?
It's in Georgetown Mall, down right on River. It's the old warehouse in the mall. I think it might be Crabtree and Evelyn's. It's one of the old perfumeries, but it still sells Lafayette's favorite.
What city is that?
Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay.
It's right in the river, right in Georgetown. You can get a little collection of it or a big bottle.
Yeah, but where do you park?
Take the metro. If you still have some of it. It's a nice scent, actually.
I'll look into that. My son lives down close to that. I can take the metro. I don't have to. I tried to park in there one time.
It's one of the international all over your hub. To this, to that, and they still carry this evidence.
Okay. So that's an experience, a Washington experience you should have. And, well, George Washington did like to dance with the ladies. He was kind of a ladies' man.
And we had to wear that stuff then because everybody stuck.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Well, I encourage all of you to spread the word and let your friends know that when we next celebrate our 250th anniversary, that we shouldn't forget Lafayette. He was full partner.
And that is a great book.
Yep. I've got some interesting Limoges plates up here that you might want to just take a look at that take pictures of different parts of his life. Thank you.
Thank you.